We've been talking about different patterns of evolution and different examples that we see in the fossil record. And what I want to do next is to kind of talk about the idea of, is there any conditions or situations in which evolution will not happen? Is there a way to look at a population and tell if it's evolving or not? And that leads us to this idea of something called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. Hardy and Weinberg are two scientists, Jeffrey Hardy and Willem Weinberg, and what they did was to come up with a mathematical way to look at populations and describe whether they're changing or not. They developed an equation, or a set of equations, that could be used to predict frequencies of alleles in a population, and based on looking at phenotypes, how an organism looks, and then use math to determine whether a population is evolving or not. So they actually came up with a mathematical equation looking at homozygous dominant, heterozygous organisms, homozygous recessive organisms, and using math to determine whether a population is evolving by looking at phenotypes and genotypes of individuals in a population. Okay, so what the Hardy-Weinberg principle says is that your allele frequency, remember, alleles are choices for genes like blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes. Allele frequencies in a population are going to stay the same, remain constant, unless something happens to cause them to change, unless there are factors that cause the frequency of those alleles to change. And so what we need to do if we're looking at the idea of evolution in populations is, if you have a situation where the allele frequencies don't change, they stay constant, we would say the population is in genetic equilibrium. Equilibrium, it stays equal. The frequencies of the alleles don't change. And in that situation, if we're not changing alleles, changing gene choices, the population is going to stay the same, and it would not be evolving. So what we need to do in order to understand Hardy-Weinberg is to look at what are those factors that can cause a population to change. And we're going to watch a short little video about how that works.
The 5 fingers of evolution. A thorough understanding of biology requires a thorough understanding of the process of evolution. Most people are familiar with the process of natural selection. However, this is just one of 5 processes that can result in evolution. Before we discuss all 5 of these processes, we should define evolution. Evolution is simply change in the gene pool over time. But what is a gene pool? And for that matter, what is a gene? Before spending any more time on genetics, let us begin with a story. Imagine that a boat capsizes and 10 survivors swim to shore on a deserted island. They are never rescued, and they form a new population that exists for thousands of years. Strangely enough, 5 of the survivors have red hair. Red hair is created when a person inherits 2 copies of the red gene from their parents. If you only have 1 copy of the gene, you won't have red hair. To make this easier, we will assume that the 5 non-redheads are not carriers of the gene. The initial frequency of the red hair gene is therefore 50%, or 10 of 20 total genes. These genes are the gene pool. The 20 different genes are like cards in a deck that keep getting reshuffled with each new generation. Sex is simply a reshuffling of the genetic deck. The cards are reshuffled and passed to the next generation. The deck remains the same, 50% red. The genes are reshuffled and passed to the next generation. The gene pool remains the same, 50% red. Even though the population may grow in size over time, the frequency should stay at about 50%. If this frequency ever varies, then evolution has occurred. Evolution is simply change in the gene pool over time. Think about it in terms of the cards. If the frequency of the cards in the deck ever changes, evolution has occurred. There are 5 processes that can cause the frequency to change. To remember these processes, we will use the fingers on your hands, starting from the little finger and moving to the thumb. The little finger should remind you that the population can shrink. If the population shrinks, then chance can take over. For example, if only 4 individuals survive an epidemic, then their genes will represent the new gene pool. The next finger is the ring finger. This finger should remind you of mating because a ring represents a couple. If individuals choose a mate based on their appearance or location, the frequency may change. If red-headed individuals only mate with red-headed individuals, they could eventually form a new population. If no one ever mates with red-headed individuals, these genes could decrease. The next finger is the middle finger. The M in the middle finger should remind you of the M in the word mutation. If a new gene is added through mutation, it can affect the frequency. Imagine a gene mutation creates a new color of hair. This would obviously change the frequency in the gene pool. The pointer finger should remind you of movement. If new individuals flow into an area or immigrate, the frequency will change. If individuals flow out of an area or emigrate, then the frequency will change. In science, we refer to this movement as gene flow. All 4 of the processes represented by our fingers can cause evolution. Small population size, non-random mating, mutations, and gene flow. However, none of them lead to adaptation. Natural selection is the only process that creates organisms better adapted to their local environment. I use the thumb to remember this process. Nature votes thumbs up for adaptations that will do well in their environment and thumbs down to adaptations that will do poorly. The genes for individuals that are not adapted for their environment will gradually be replaced by those that are better adapted. Red hair is an example of one of these adaptations. Red hair is an advantage in the northern climates because the fair skin allowed ancestors to absorb more light and synthesize more vitamin D. Thumbs up. However, this was a disadvantage in the more southern climates where increased UV radiation led to cancer and decreased fertility. Thumbs down. Even the thumb itself is an adaptation formed through the process of natural selection. The evolution that we have described is referred to as microevolution because it refers to a small change. However, this form of evolution may eventually lead to macroevolution or speciation. Every organism on the planet shares ancestry with a single common ancestor. All living organisms on the planet are connected back in time through the process of evolution. Take a look at your own hand. It's an engineering masterpiece that was created by the 5 processes I just described over millions and millions of years. Can you recall the 5 main causes of evolution from memory? If you can't, hit rewind and watch that part again. But if you can, give yourself or your neighbor a big 5-fingered high five.
Okay, so let's write those 5 things down now. 5 conditions that are required to maintain equilibrium. Remember, keep evolution from happening. So use your hand to help you remember. Let's start with our little finger. Remember, little finger reminds us that populations can't be small. These are all the things that you can't have if you want the population to not change. So populations have to be large. They can't be small. Because in small populations, weird things can happen just by random chance. Number 2 is your ring finger. That reminds us of couples and mating. We can't have organisms choosing mates. Mating has to be random. If you're selecting for a mate that's got a big tail or brighter colors, or you're not giving everyone a fair chance, and if you're selecting for certain traits, it's going to change the frequencies in the population. So we got to have random mating. We also can't have mutations. Middle finger, M for mutations. If mutations happen to bring new choices into our gene pool, that's going to change the gene frequencies. 4th finger, pointer finger, that was for movement. No moving in or out. If you have organisms coming into the population, bringing in new genes, or taking genes from the population and going to another place, that's going to cause changes to our gene pool. And lastly, thumbs up, who survives and who doesn't. We can't have natural selection happening. If you are selecting for organisms to survive in that place, you're going to change the frequency of the gene pool. So, in order for equilibrium to stay equal, to keep the population from changing, to stop evolution from happening, We have to have all 5 of those things stay true. Population needs to be large, random mating, no mutations, no moving in or out, we call that gene flow, no natural selection. So let's talk about those things. Random mating. All members in the population must have an equal chance to produce offspring. If some organisms are more likely to reproduce than others, that's going to cause a change in the alleles in our population. We said populations have to be large. In small populations, changes can happen just due to random chance, and organisms can be it can cause a change in the frequencies of the alleles in the gene pool. No moving in or out organisms. If they leave the population and take their alleles with them, that can cause a change in the gene frequency for who's leaving and also who's coming. No mutations. Mutations add new alleles to the gene pool and change the frequencies. And then no natural selection. If we are selecting for certain organisms to be more likely to survive than others, the alleles in the population will change, and that means evolution is going to happen. In some populations, these conditions may be met or nearly met over long periods of time, and little or no change is going to happen. And if there's no change in the gene frequencies, that means there's no evolution happening. But if you look at most populations, it's pretty difficult to keep all 5 of those things, maintain all 5 of those conditions as true all the time and for long periods of time. It's very difficult for all the conditions for the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to be met. And in most populations, evolution happens. Evolution is still happening today. It's happening to populations all the time. That leads us to kind of full circle back to our idea about Lamarck and other patterns that we see. Remember, Lamarck came up with the idea, or talked about the idea, of this inheritance of acquired traits. Can acquired traits be inherited? Can you develop big muscles and pass that on to your kids? Could giraffes stretch their necks longer? Or we use that example of the little crabs using their claws and making them bigger. And as we discover more and more about biology, remember, we learn new things. We have to kind of adjust our ideas. And remember, we talked in our genetics chapter about the idea of epigenetics. We talked about Prader-Willi syndrome and Angelman syndrome, that kids who have these very different genetic problems, both are missing the same piece of chromosome number 15. In Prader-Willi, the piece that's missing came from dad. And in Angelman syndrome, the maternal piece of chromosome 15 is missing. On the mom chromosome, remember, organisms have 2 copies of every chromosome, one from dad, one from mom. And the difference that produces these very different phenotypes, these very different syndromes, is due to something called genomic imprinting, a change that happens not in the gene code, but in how those genes are expressed. It's a change in the regulatory system, which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. So the idea of adding or removing methyl tags, remember, can be influenced by the environment. It can be a change that's added to the gene code because of physical things in the environment, the things that you experience. We watched that little movie about methyl tags in twins and how they become different with age. We saw the agouti rats and how changing the diet of the mom can affect the expression of genes in her offspring and change the gene for being overweight, obese, and yellow fur to having offspring that have thin, skinny babies with different colors of fur. If you want to refresh your brain and watch that little movie again that we watched You can follow the video link here or look on the webpage. The link is there to refresh your brain about that idea. But think about things that you do in your lifetime, being able to pass those characteristics onto your kids, onto your offspring, onto your grandkids. What's different about this idea from what Lamarck came up with? Remember, Lamarck said that you could physically change something about your body and then pass that trait on, even if it wasn't in the genes. And we now know that any changes that happen to organisms have to be in the genes, even ones that are caused by environmental influences. Epigenetics changes the way the genes are expressed, and it's those tags that would be passed on to affect your kids and your grandkids. So in a way, the idea of acquiring something in your lifetime and passing it on to your kids is true, as long as that change actually changes the genetic information that's passed on to offspring. That ends our slideshow right here, and we are done with our chapter on evolution. Thanks for watching.